I know that you've also done some work on sleep and emotional processing, so not just learning and memory processing. And that's particularly interesting to me because I'm very interested in mental health, psychotherapy, this sort of thing, and improving mental health. And if sleep helps with emotional processing in a way that might be therapeutic, I'm quite curious to hear about this. So, what is the story here, or the connection between emotions and sleep?
So, the relationship between sleep and emotions is complex, and it's complex in the normal population. It gets perhaps more complex in things like PTSD. So let's start with the normal situation. For normal episodic memories, it appears that the sleep stage that's most important for their stabilization across the night of sleep is that deep non-REM sleep, that slow wave sleep early in the night, unless it's an emotional episodic memory. And then it seems to depend on REM sleep later in the night. Now, whether that's because it's an emotional memory or because emotional memories are just a different animal, I don't know. What do I mean by that? If I'm having you learn word pairs and I give you my favorite word pair of the day, tape, fish, if you're trying to remember that word pair, you sort of repeat in your mind, whether you think about it or not, tape, fish, tape, fish, tape, fish. If you have the word pair mother rape, then your brain goes all over the place and brings in 100 other memories and 100 other questions and embeds that word pair in the whole question of, oh my God, I assume my mother was, she could never, she could, I don't know. Geez, that would have been, and I know so-and-so who was raped. And your mind just doesn't just sit there and go, mother rape, mother rape, mother rape. It brings in a huge constellation of other information. And so whether the different sleep stage dependence of non-emotional and emotional memories is just the fact that they're emotional or not emotional, or whether they are stored so critically different from one another that they call on these different stages. But we know that emotional memories tend to depend on memory late in the night. We know that with emotional memories, if you have people look at a bunch of photographs that show scenes of some neutral background scene of a room or a house or a street, and then some object in the foreground, and half of those objects are negative and aversive, and you have them just look at them and rate whether this is something you would approach or not approach. That's all you ask them to do. And then later you test them on the object and the background separately because you originally made the photo with Photoshop. So you show them, okay, this crashed up car, did you ever see it before? This street, did you see it before? We test those separately. What we find is that across the night, whether it's emotional or neutral, they forget about 20% of what they remembered immediately after we showed them to them. So they forget the emotional objects, the neutral objects, the backgrounds for both. After a night of sleep, they again have forgotten about 20% of each of these, except the emotional objects. And those they don't forget at all. So the brain somehow, when we're sleeping, says, this is an emotional scene. This is the emotional core of it. I'm going to remember that emotional core, and I'm going to forget the background. This other picture I saw, it's not emotional at all. I'm going to forget all of it. Now, of course, the brain doesn't have that conversation, right? The brain isn't mentally reviewing these and choosing what to maintain and what not to. There's something in the way they're initially encoded in the brain that tells the brain, this is something to be strengthened. This is something that I should allow to decay. So that's one thing that we know sleep does. It uses a different stage of sleep, and it can selectively maintain the critical elements of an emotional memory while letting everything else be forgotten. We also know that after a night of sleep, if you show people emotional scenes before they go to bed, and this is compared to being awake for the same interval, they will remember the emotional scenes better than neutral scenes they were shown before. But the actual emotion evoked in them when they see the scene, so they have a scene of a baby with a huge tumor where her left eye should be. She remembers, that the subject remembers seeing that picture better than if they had just been awake for 12 hours. But the emotion that it arouses in them on seeing it again is weakened. And this is what Matt Walker and his student, Elspeth Summerin, no, I've forgotten her last name. What they showed, what they call the model of sleep to remember and sleep to forget. So sleep strengthens your ability to recognize an emotional scene as one you saw before, but reduces the affect associated with it. So we know that sleep does that too. And finally, we know that overall sleep just, I want to say, makes you a little happier, makes you see the world as happier. What do I mean? If you show people faces that have been morphed between a neutral face and an angry face, or a neutral face and a sad face, or a neutral face and a happy face, and you take all of these in-between faces and you show them to people before they've slept, or you show them to them after they've slept, they tend to rate all the faces as happier after they've slept. So a face that looked slightly angry before they went to bed looks neutral, and one that looked neutral looks a little happy. So there's a change in how we perceive the world emotionally as a result of sleep. Can I tell you about PTSD?
Can we hold off on PTSD for a minute and talk about the things that, because you just said a number of very interesting things. The first thing, I mean, you answered this before I could ask, but I was going to ask how you test emotional processing in the lab and whether it requires a completely different paradigm. But it's neat that you're able to, at least for, in some cases, just sort of twist the existing paradigm, like with the word matching tasks, to include, as opposed to tape and chair, mother and rape, you just emotionally charge the words. That's very neat.
When we're just looking at, so when we talk about emotional memory, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about maybe a single event, driving down the road and seeing someone hit a cat that runs out in the road, and we have that as an episodic memory. We have an emotional memory of our reaction to it. If we talked about it in therapy, the therapist would say, how did you react? And they might say, I was bummed by it, but it wasn't a big deal. Or I just broke down and cried because I've got a cat at home and I imagined it being hurt. So there's an emotional memory that forms. And there's an incredibly rich associative network that it gets tied into. So that episodic memory gets tied in with every other memory you have of a car accident. It has tied into every memory you have of an animal getting hurt or an animal being sick. It ties into every memory of a cat especially, but other animals that you know, and to stories that you've heard about other animals. So it constructs this So when you say, what's the memory? Well, we can ask whether they can remember cat tape. We can ask, do you remember seeing this cat? Is this the cat that you saw hit by the car? Or is this the cat that you saw hit by the car? And show them pictures of two cats. We can do that sort of testing of episodic memory. Testing of the others require different techniques and sometimes totally different instrumentation. So we can measure sympathetic body responses to seeing the picture again as opposed to the first time. Or we can just ask them to free associate to it and see how broad a network they get after sleep as opposed to before sleep. That's never been done. But the wiring someone up to measure their blink reaction and their heart rate and their breath rate, that's been done. Skin conductance responses, that's been done to look at what their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system responses to seeing that image are after a night of sleep as opposed to before a night of sleep as opposed to across a day awake. So we use the same tools and we bring in new tools.
And then the other thing before we get to PTSD that I wanted to ask about. So when you are confronted with these three findings that you mentioned, that the brain prioritizes remembering the emotional content of an episode, it reduces your affective response, at least your negative affective response to these episodes, and then 3, it lends a more positive valence to experience. When you're confronted with these three findings, there are a lot of different questions you could ask. My understanding is that the sorts of questions that you're interested in are what's going on in the brain that mediates these responses, or these behaviors. But another direction, one that I'm curious if you've thought at all about this, is whether or what the evolutionary story or theory is for why we would exhibit these behaviors, they would be selected for.
Sure. So I'll do the second question first because I've forgotten the first one already. Evolutionarily, all of these make perfect sense. Emotions arise in us when something happens that's important to us. That's the simplest way to say it. It can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. It can be a startling thing where we don't even know whether it's good or bad. But something has happened that has caused our brain to say, whoa, what was that? And the argument would be that anytime the brain says that, the information that's coming in, the information that's being encoded at that moment, is at least for the moment important and worth holding on to and worth strengthening. So why does the brain seem to improve emotional memories more than neutral memories? Just because it makes good evolutionary sense. If I walk across the street and a car goes in front of me, I don't need to remember that tomorrow. If I walk across the street and a car swerves and almost hits me, then I have to remember that. And that's the one that will get strengthened while I sleep. Whether, my mother always used to say things will look better in the morning. And that's what the study that Matt's group carried out showed, that things just do generically look better in the morning. And I would actually twist this around backwards and say, well, the fact that evolution has chosen that to be the case means that it is valuable evolutionarily. It is better to look at things from a more positive attitude the next morning. I don't know if you've ever read the studies, but the studies show that people who are depressed are more accurate predictors of what's going to happen than people who are happy, which is sort of a funny thing. But it again suggests that we have evolved to be hopeful, to put good spins on things, to try to map things to an understanding that's more positive. And I guess in the long term, that evolution has found that works, that we do better if we make that assumption.
That is, it's surprising to me that if the depressed individuals are better predictors, we would evolve to be happier.
You want me to try to spin it for you?
Please.
It might be that what's most important from an evolutionary perspective is not to most accurately predict what's going to happen, as to predict something a little better than that. That in so doing, it pushes you to act in a way that will make that better outcome more likely.
Yeah, I have a good example right now. The podcast business is very competitive. The best prediction would probably be, given the data, that this podcast would fail. But if I weren't optimistic about it, I wouldn't have done it. And yeah, so.
And for all those people who tried and failed, they can turn to you and say, well, you were just lucky. And you can say, well, in some sense, maybe I was lucky because I couldn't know that it was going to succeed. It wasn't just luck. It was how I did it. And my cleverness and smartness and likability are what made it work. But you're right. I had no right to expect it to work out. But, if we were all Eeyores, right? I mean, Eeyore is your classic depressed individual. I mean, you'd never do anything. You'd sit at home and say, the odds are if I go out and look for a job today, I will fail. So you have to wake up in the morning and say, okay, let's give it one more try. So maybe, this all feels very mushy to me. I feel kind of embarrassed talking this way, but I will take evolution as a very harsh teacher. Evolution does not settle on things that don't work. And so maybe having that positive attitude is important if you want to optimize your outcome.